How is race formulated? In order to answer this question, we need to visit the racial formation theory constructed by two very well-known scholars in sociology, whose last name is Omi and Winnet. They developed this theory in 1966, and this theory is constantly being revisited and revised. So they are interested in the process of racial formation, but different from what we covered in the previous lectures. These two scholars are not interested in what specific historical events constructed race. They were not necessarily interested in what are the current events that participated in the reinforcement of racial inequality and racism. Instead, they are interested in, from an abstract and a theoretical level, what forces contributed to the formation of race. And more specifically, they are interested in the socio-historical process by which racial categories are created, inhabited, transformed, and destroyed. They later developed this understanding that the power associated with race as a social structure is not necessarily attributed to how race is categorized. It is not about racial categorization. Instead, it is more about what are the social and cultural meanings attached to race. And they define the process within which social and cultural meanings are attached to race as racial project. And more specifically, racial project refers to a way of giving meaning to racial categories through cultural representation and social structures. So recall that I have reflected my experience of always being an Asian, but developed different understanding of my racial and ethnic identities when I was living in China versus when I'm living in the United States. This is a process within which I realized that there are different culture and social meanings attached to my racial categories, although my racial identity have not changed. So some of you may ask, can we also participate in racial project? According to Omi and Winnet, everyone can participate in a racial project, but you need to have certain power to participate in racial project. And they believe that the government has the power to participate in racial project. And more specifically, government can form race through racial project. While Omi and Winnet really highlight the importance of government, it does not mean that individuals cannot have the power to form race through racial project. So for instance, we can see the type of dialogue and negotiation between government and individuals that includes community leaders, policymakers, and a lot of people who are affiliated with community to collaborate with each other, negotiate with each other to engage in a racial project. And this example is the push to have Hispanic, North Africans, and Middle Eastern as races in the 2020 census. So the government said racial should be categorized in this form according to the census, but everyday people, we as individuals say we do not agree. We need to negotiate with you, engage in a dialogue with you to form race through racial project. We say that races also need to include Hispanics, North African, and Middle Eastern. So there is this constant dialogue between government and individuals, although according to Omi and Winnet, government has a very salient power to engage in racial project and formulate race. Okay, but is every racial project racist project? No, this is not the case. Racial projects becomes racist when they produce a structure of domination and hegemony. So a follow-up question may be, what does domination mean? What does hegemony mean? Instead, if we reflect upon the history of race and racism in the United States, we have observed the domination and hegemony. Domination is defined as the direct rule by coercion. So for instance, Jim Crow racism is an example of domination in the producing of racist projects. Under Jim Crow racism, people of color, especially individuals who identify as being Black and African Americans, were not allowed to share the resources with white people. So this is a very salient example on the reproduction of racism through domination. But hegemony is something that is different. It includes both coercion and consent. So to some extent, a reproduction of racism through hegemony is more difficult to be identified. And in fact, colorblind racism is a type of racism that is established both on coercion and consent. To some extent, because colorblind racism does not manifest it in a way of explicit racism in our everyday life. As we recall, colorblind racism illustrates a tendency to attribute race-related disparities to non-racial dynamics. So sometimes we may not perceive the problems as being racist, and this develops some room for us to develop an consent in addition to coercion in the reproduction of racism. So this further highlight the importance for us to take a class on race and inequality to better identify the different mechanisms that are reproducing racism in our societies, even in a way that is not as salient as explicit racism that is based on domination. So this is pretty much the end of this series of lecture. And in this lecture, we have covered a lot of the concepts, and many of the concepts share similar theoretical names. So in the next and last video clip, I will go through the theoretical concept with you, and hopefully we will develop a relatively clear understanding on the theoretical foundations in the analysis of racial inequality from a sociological perspective. I will see you in the last video clip.